Superheroes are getting called our modern myths quite a lot. Comparing the myths of the past to our current superhero obsession, you can see why. Superheroes are meant to be these aspirational individuals who can represent something about ourselves and society. They kind of connects us, but also makes us feel a little bit individualized. So it's unsurprising we even have Greek and North myths incorporated into the characters of these universes, which has been done for like decades and decades now. People have also pointed out that society is a little bit different than it was at the time of traditional myths. We have a different understanding of how the world works now. We don't really end up calling things myths anymore because we feel pretty grounded in the idea that we know what did and didn't happen, unless you're Alex Jones. As much as you might like Tony Stark, you understand that he never really existed, unless you're Jordan Peterson. But then we have characters like Captain America who just look so close to the myth that maybe the reality is that myth isn't as dead as we thought. Instead, the issue is that we understand the idea of myths poorly. I want to use Captain America as an explainer for modern myths, specifically the myth of America. And we can use a French thinker from the 50s called Roland Barthes, I probably butchered that, to explain Captain America and all myths in a way that includes modern ideas. So, first we gotta get through some theory, unfortunately, but none of it's too complicated. Barthes thinks mythology is a semiotic process, but we can think of semiotics as referring to how symbols and signs get their meaning. Fuck the academic terminology, it's really as simple as that. And when we say signs and symbols, we could be referring to nearly anything. It could be a word or a phrase or a picture, even a character in a comic book. You can guess which one I'm gonna pick. So we can think of Captain America or Steve Rogers as a symbol in the same way, and that's how we're gonna analyze him. We're gonna analyze him as a symbol. But what does the simple symbol of Captain America mean? Well, he's a World War II hero from New York named Steve Rogers, who has superhuman abilities given to him by an army experiment to create the perfect super soldier. If you're watching this, you probably already know the story by now. But yeah, he fights some Nazis, he gets frozen in some ice, and ends up being thawed out like a chicken breast from a freezer, so he can keep on fighting crime in the modern day. In most stories, he represents American values of freedom, liberty, fraternité, égalité. No, that's France, but you get the idea. He has the stripes on Chris Evans' six-pack, and a big star on his shield representing the only US state that matters, Puerto Rico. Regardless, that's how we think of the symbol of Captain America. Barthes thinks that symbol is made up of a physical image of Chris Evans, which you would call like a signifier. And then we have the meaning we tie to that image, which is Steve Rogers, the character. We can call that the signified. The signifier and the signified can be easy to mix up, but just think of it as the image of Chris Evans, the actor, and the story of Steve Rogers, the character, coming together to make the symbol of Steve Rogers, a fucking sexy patriotic man. We can even use this simple diagram or a simple equation to explain this, like the signifier plus the signified equals a symbol. Or we can call it a sign. I'm not your English teacher. We call this process signification, which is basically how we give meaning to anything in our language. It was developed by a guy called Saussure, again French, and he came up with it about 100 years ago, and it's pretty important to linguistics and communications, not that it matters. However, Barthes says that mythology does something a little bit funky to our symbol of Steve Rogers to create a mythological symbol. It goes through a whole nother process of signification on top of the process we just spoke about. Now, say we take the symbol of Steve Rogers and instead of applying a literal meaning to it, we add on top a concept which the symbol will now become associated to, becoming the mythical symbol of Captain America, representing the concept of American values. It's like the symbol of Steve Rogers has become just another image, but instead of it being an image for its own meaning, it's also now become a symbol for a concept. The concept of Americanness, a myth for Americanness. We can do the same thing we did last time, where we have this diagram to show how the secondary signification process works, which we can call the mythological signification. It happens on top of the original process, so it's kind of just like another layer of meaning that we've added on to the original meaning. So we have the original image plus its meaning, which makes a symbol. Then the symbol has a concept applied to it to make it a mythological symbol, which would look something like this. SR plus SD equals SG plus SDC equals MSG. It's a little bit complicated. It's basically the same as what we did before, just happening again, where we add the signifier to the signified, which becomes the symbol, except now we're taking the symbol and we're adding on top of the symbol a signified concept, which creates the mythical symbol. And I've put down the signified concept as SDC and the mythified symbol as MSG, except it's going to be less tasty than the Chinese version, but still, it's going to be alright. This is the process of mythical signification. And Barthes thinks there's something funny going on here with mythology, or with creating something as a myth. Steve Rogers isn't just representing Americanness, he is in some way consumed by it. We can see this when we look at the actions of Steve Rogers in the comics or movies, as they become gestures of Americanness, and we start to lose the original meaning we once had with Steve Rogers. We start to think of Captain America as taking just as prominent a role in our imagination, and the imagination within the world Steve Rogers lives in. It's almost like the concept of Americanness written into Captain America, and this secondary mythification process is using Steve Rogers as a vessel to impose a new meaning onto his actions. Captain America punching Hitler is no longer Steve Rogers, the super soldier, punching Hitler, but is a gesture that America is fighting fascism. In some part of our mind, not all of it, but some part, Steve Rogers has taken a back seat, and we see the myth more clearly than the reality of what's being presented to us. And it's not random the way these things happen. Captain America doesn't just accidentally become tied to the concept of Americanness. These concepts that get tacked onto symbols are reflections of the moments and locations they find themselves in. They are grounded in their social function for those who create the myth, but we'll come back to that later. The main thing to understand is the concept is always historically specific. It always adapts to its surroundings. The concept is then this collection of things which we end up associating together depending on what the specific function of the concept is. Meaning the concept can attach itself to a whole number of things. Like with Americanness, you have baseball, and then you also have Lincoln, while also having hamburgers or McDonald's or shitty pizza or KFC, and unsurprisingly, obesity. Yet the things we associate will change over time. No one in the 1910s associated McDonald's with America, because McDonald's didn't exist. But in the movies and comics, the Americanness of Captain America is a bit strange because it pulls from an active sense of America, but also, narratively, it has to pull from what should be an older sense of America from World War II. Steve Rogers represents the America of today, and the America of yesterday. But that's the thing, the concept of America ends up being presented as kind of the same in both. Captain America seems to represent both simultaneously because all concepts in myth are in some ways a bit shapeless due to this weird way that they just start associating certain things together. Unlike the America we know in history that has changed and has a complicated, conflicting yet fixed history, which doesn't get to choose what it associates itself with. It is or is not America's history. And maybe it's good for us to think about the concept of America and the history of America for a second to present those conflicting elements. We associate the concept of America probably most strongly with the idea of freedom, but it's also a country with a long and storied history of not respecting the freedom of its African American population in slavery, Jim Crow, and then the system of racism still around today. The concept of America is meant to fight imperialism like the British, the fascists, and the communists, but historically, America also became a superpower who toppled democratic states and became a global hegemon who started wars over resources. And not to belabor the point, but the concept of America is supposed to be the home of the world champions of football. But last time I checked, they've never won a fucking World Cup, so that seems like a bit of a fucking lie to me. But the point is, the concept of Americanness in the case of myth actually doesn't have the need to tell you a complete history as part of its function. Like Captain America, the myth lives out of time, because the concept is an association of things, and that association lives in our collective memories, almost like a dream. It floats in our minds and collects themes for a certain function, while dropping other themes which don't help the function. And we will get to the function later, I'm just teasing you a bit. But back to the point. The concept is made of things specific to a moment and location in history, but presents as if it were beyond history. That's what myth is meant to be after all, something that goes beyond just our current circumstances. It represents something bigger. But now we have this idea of the concept as a kind of non-historically accurate dream. Let's think about what we talked about before. My favorite pastime, punching Nazis. When Captain America punches Hitler, we still understand consciously that this is Steve Rogers punching Adolf Hitler, but we actually also see this general concept of America fighting fascism. And even going beyond that, we have a good versus evil, or the idea of two opposites conflicting, one punching the other, one fighting the other. But the reason I picked this is because the image is so striking. There's a certain caricaturish element to it, and that's another thing about the myth. The myth thrives with those characters or those images which seem to become caricatures of themselves. The same way the concept is a caricature of reality. Steve Rogers is the perfect American patriot to the point of ridiculousness. I mean, the man can't even swear without saying a prayer of forgiveness to his mother's apple pie. But we can use another example of Batman, who becomes the caricature of order and justice to the point he almost loses the original Bruce Wayne. He even literally states in the movie something like, Batman needs to be a symbol. Bruce Wayne consciously wants to make Batman into a myth, even in his own universe, and becomes a caricature of law and order to do so. It's not only like we're losing history when we see the concept attach itself to myth, but we're also losing the reality of the character and the myth of their own story.
When Captain America throws his mighty shield, all those who chose to oppose his shield must yield.
Our boy Steve then has a strange experience as a mythical figure, in that he retains his original meaning while then also becoming the form which the concept will fit into. Steve becomes the container for Americanness, the same way water fills into the form of a container, or a glass, or a vase, or anything it's poured into. The myth pours itself into the caricature, just like pouring vodka into a water bottle. Yet another one of my favorite pastimes. But much like my vodka water bottle, the mythical figure is trying to hide something. It's trying to hide its influence in plain sight. He tells us one thing while also imposing something else onto us, because the function of the concept is rarely named. And again, I promise the function will be explained in just a minute. So we know the concept is based on a certain function, which is how it decides what object it will latch onto. And we know that the myth inevitably needs to drop certain historical information, but keep what serves its purpose, to present us with a nice, clean image, and prefers to do so through a caricature of reality. Steve doesn't realize that his usage as a symbol is necessary for the myth's survival, because it would crumble if it had to exist through a simple symbol of an actual historical Americanness. Instead, and this is important, through Captain America, Americanness as a ahistorical concept gets naturalized because it hides its inaccuracies. Captain America is Americanness, and Americanness is Captain America. Yet we don't understand Captain America as being used for a function. We view him as a logical explanation of Americanness. So the myth which Captain America conjures, like all myth, is not just a presentation, but is a suggestion subtly convincing us of its inaccurate version of reality. It is telling us what the mythical America is without even having to speak. It wants us to act as if America was this non-conflicting essence of the good guy, like Captain America is. To get this idea down, we can even do like a quick summary of the Captain America movies and kind of show how it parodies certain historical events for the sake of its myth. So in Captain America and the First Avenger, the first film is based on a classical war film of a simple American patriot who's a nobody at home but becomes a hero in the fight against fascism, or super fascists in the case of Hydra. And in some ways, this is not the most inaccurate of movies. The fascists were the bad guys, and the Americans were also right to be fighting against them. What's misleading here is the simplicity of the story and the caricatured nature of the fight. For one thing, something I had completely forgotten about, at one stage they have this montage of Captain America fighting Hydra baddies, and one of the scenes just involves a super tank which is like 20 feet tall, and looks like something from an anime. It's almost impossibly American. The explosion, the symbol of Captain America jumping off this tank as he blows it up, it's pretty amazing. And before that, they even referenced the comic book moment of Hitler getting punched by Captain America by showing people buying the propaganda and by showing Hitler getting punched in this comic book that didn't really happen in the reality of the universe, but happened in the comics of the universe. So it's like a nice nod. Instead, what they do is they make the Red Skull into Super Hitler, who kind of even makes the Nazis look not quite as evil as he is, which is why the Red Skull's evil plan for world domination leads even one of the Nazis in the movie to be left in shock. So then we get this super justification for Captain America beating up the Red Skull and stopping his evil plan and having to sacrifice himself for the greater good. But here's the thing. While America was on the right side of the fight in World War II, it's not exactly as simple as World War II movies would make it out. Before and even during World War II, America was a pretty complicated environment when it came to race. Around the 1910s and 20s, the Jewish population weren't even considered white following the substantial migration of Slavic Jews. This migration led to a lot of American anti-Semitism, and it was only really during the war and after the war that America really started to define itself on these non-anti-Semitic lines after having just spent 20 years discriminating against the Jews. We also need to get into the fact that the African-American citizens were second, if not third-class citizens at this stage, and there was a strange racial divide even within the whites, in which the Irish and the Italians weren't quite viewed as the same as other whiteness. But the Captain America movie tells us that this was a simpler time for Americanness, where the fight was simple. Fascists are bad, Americans are good. And in some ways it was, but the real history is more opaque than that. During and after the war, America ended up defining itself against its enemies, the Nazis, and started telling itself that it was always the opposite of fascism. When the reality is the Nazis used America as somewhat of a blueprint for some of its own ideas. And just for a second, we see this complexity creep through in the movie where the Red Skull, who is basically Super Hitler, says to the white 6'2" Captain America, "We could be on the same side. We're superior." It's almost like there's this moment where the movie winks towards how the Nazis did probably see America as a little bit of a template in some ways. Also, side note, another thing I forgot was Stanley Tucci being a B-Tech Einstein in this movie, which then makes a pretty clear allusion between the super soldier and the nuclear weapons bringing about freedom. It's just a weird point that I completely forgot when watching this movie like a decade ago. Now, Captain America 2, The Winter Soldier, is also a strange reinterpretation of a historical set of movies, the Cold War spy movies. While most of the Cold War spy movies were set in the 1970s or 80s or whatever, this movie is set obviously in modern day. America is presented as being more complicated here, and the plot does reflect that little bit more of a complicated attitude towards good and evil. But the concept still follows this Cold War narrative of the enemy within, as Captain America's old sidekick, Bucky, becomes a Manchurian candidate who turns evil and starts fighting against S.H.I.E.L.D. for Hydra, and Captain America has to try and stop his friend, who's turned to the wrong side, who's turned to evil. At the same time, you have S.H.I.E.L.D., who's kind of like this veiled synonym for the CIA or something, or maybe the FBI, or both, in a terrifying world. But S.H.I.E.L.D. gets exposed as really being run by Hydra fascists. Similar to the Cold War fear of people possibly being communists, secretly working against American interests. We've obviously seen parallel myths like that today with Trump's current obsession with the enemy from within, this idea that there are secretly people within the government or secretly other Americans who are actually working against the interest of America. But the thing is, this movie came out a year before Trump even announced running, so it kind of predates any of what Trump's kind of political ravings have been so far, outside of obviously his Twitter rants. But I don't think this movie was probably making too many references to that, to be honest. But look, the movie does have a little bit more of a complex messaging. Bucky does come back to the side of good somewhat, but there's still a feeling here that Captain America still represents a pure American patriot who does the right thing at all times, who always upholds American values. despite the fact that the leadership of its institutions have possibly been corrupted away from the American values that Captain America holds so dear. I mean, Captain America even becomes a fugitive in the movie, going around checks and balances just to, get things done in the way that he sees right. This is despite the fact that Captain America is allied to a former Russian spy in the Black Widow, which almost seems prophetic now, looking back on the way the first Trump presidency went with the whole Russia controversy, if you want to call it that. And to address this myth, we should point out the phenomenon of McCarthyism, which was a response to this communist fear, the Red Scare that was currently happening in America. This was a means of suppressing, but also, targeting and identifying any possible communists within America to make sure that they didn't have a malign influence upon American interests. But honestly, McCarthyism is the conflicting point of this Cold War narrative. There weren't as many communists as people thought. The fear was over-exaggerated on the part of the media of the time and also just of the general population who are completely afraid of there possibly being some secret communists possibly amongst them. It actually led to, due to McCarthyism and various other cultural phenomena of the time, a lot of censorship and a lot of unnecessary fear, which isn't to say that there wasn't some kind of threat from the Soviet Union, and which wasn't to say that there wasn't any hostility between the two, but the point is that the level of fear that was created around possible secret infiltrations into America was completely overblown. So effectively there is this idea of true patriotism coming through to the rescue, or this idea that the true patriot is a good guy in America, but clearly at times the true patriot has actually suppressed freedom of speech and has possibly hurt other Americans just in its attempt to protect people from this imagined threat that the patriot is always worried about, the true patriot might always be worried about. But still, it's actually a pretty good movie. I enjoyed watching it again, like I did watching the first one. They're both actually pretty good movies. If you can get past the whole patriotism American myth thing, they're pretty enjoyable to watch. Now, the third movie is also quintessentially American. Captain America Civil War is literally a civil war. Now, it's based on the comic book with the same name, Civil War, which parodied the 9/11 aftermath of the Patriot Act, which impacted regular citizens' freedoms. But the comic was quite flawed, but it had its heart in the right place, I guess. The movie, though, seems to do something a little worrying upon further analysis. Captain America and his super pals are involved in fighting against an event which inadvertently kills thousands of people despite the hero's best effort to save civilians. So the government wants to, quite rationally in my opinion, bring in a policy which puts some limits on superpowered individuals so that they can't just do whatever they want and risk normal people's lives. Why does Captain America disagree with it? Because he views it as limiting his freedoms to go out and do what he sees as right, even though it might conflict with political interests, because good is not political. Tony Stark represents the side which says that regulation is good, and that putting limits on superpowers is actually how they need to act. It's almost like a weirdly veiled allegory in two ways. One reading could be that Captain America represents America as a superpower who has a natural right to go out and save other countries, taking down dictatorships and making sure that they have control of any oil pipelines, because nothing ever went wrong with American intervention before. The second reading is a little bit more out there, but I think it's interesting to mention at the very least. So let's think of it like this. A horrible event happens, which the good guys weren't able to stop with their own powers, so the government comes along and asks to regulate those powers, which kind of ended up in the beginning causing the terrible event to happen. Captain America believes that he has the right to his arms, I guess literally his just arms in this case, and becomes a fugitive from the government that is overbearingly attempt to limit his rights to protect himself and others. I don't know if I really need to explain this myth, but it seems like it could even be compared to gun control for a moment, and the general right-wing response to it, which says that we need these superpowers, we need these arms to be able to stop the bad guys with superpowers or the bad guys with arms. But if the historical president and the just general rest of the world tell us anything, it's probably a good idea to limit these powers to stop people dying. So I don't know, it seems like an American issue. But in these three movies, we have three myths about America represented. One myth about World War II, one myth about the Cold War, and one myth even kind of going at the modern day context, and I guess you could say maybe even the previous Civil War, but it could be both. So the real question is, and I've been teasing you for a while about this, what is the function of these myths? How do we tie this together? Well, if you look a little bit deeper at Captain America, there's something that is additionally missing to his portrayal as America. There's a gaping hole of historical America that's missing here. It's capitalism, baby. I know what you're thinking. We finally reached the capitalism argument in a video essay done by a white boy who likes socialism. This is it. This is peak video essay.
Working together to produce an ever greater abundance of material and spiritual values for all. That is the secret of American prosperity.
So, whenever Barthes does his analysis, he's living in 1950s France, which is obviously capitalist at the time. But I do think there's something about his analysis of myth that could apply to nearly any society that has like a dominant group or a dominant power structure. Even the ancient Greeks had myths, so obviously it's not like it's just confined to capitalism. What Barthes thinks is the capitalist society represents something which almost puts myth into overdrive whenever capitalism develops to a certain stage. So to put it in a line, the function of myth is to retain the idea of some kind of status quo. There's some dominant idea, there's some dominant way of thinking, and the myth kind of reinforces it. So Captain America is this idea of America that is free, the idea that America is the good guy and is always the good guy, and the myth kind of tells you the story and imparts it onto you and kind of hopes that you believe it. We can take Hercules though and say of Greek myth that Hercules was this dominant idea of masculinity that was meant to be about the strong Greek man who comes along and does a load of trials and struggles and, you know, eventually becomes a part of the Greek mythology. He becomes a god himself through his trials, and he gains his father's approval, obviously, which is a classic masculinity fantasy, I think. But we need to get into why Barthes thinks the capitalist society is so specifically a special place for myth. Now, I don't want to go into the whole idea of theoretical capitalism and what it represents. We could be here for hours. So I'm just going to give you the basic idea of what's important here. So you have the bourgeois in capitalism, which is the people who own the businesses, the people who have the power in society, the people who have substantially more property or substantially more wealth than the workers, which is a big simplification, but that's how the system generally works. The bourgeois own the businesses and then they pay the workers to produce stuff, and the bourgeoisie sell the stuff for profit. The workers have to pay rent and need the work to survive. So they come and they are basically rented out by the bourgeoisie to work for them. And this is a description that not even capitalists will disagree with. This is kind of just the basic structure of capitalism, fundamentally. Now, with the bourgeoisie having more power economically due to the fact that they own the businesses and they own the way that things get made in society, it is believed that they also have the power to influence things culturally. And by the time that Barthes is writing in France, he believes that they're heading towards a point where culture is totally bourgeois. Is being made purely by the bourgeois, only putting out bourgeois opinions, only putting out bourgeois points of view. After all, the bourgeoisie controlled the TVs, the radios, newspapers, but even fashion and art was generally funded by the rich. So everything kind of becomes a part of this culture produced by the bourgeoisie, or surely they're not going to produce stuff which is anti-bourgeoisie, because if they did that, that's against their interests. So what does this have to do with myth? Well, we've been talking a lot about symbols and how they get their meaning, but the controlling class, the bourgeoisie, actually loses all meaning when a culture becomes wholly bourgeoisie, which I'm just going to call bougie from now on because I don't want to keep on saying the French word with my atrocious accent. But if all culture is representative of the bougie due to their dominance, then the concept of the bougie actually starts to lose its meaning for us. It's the classic, I'm tired of talking about capitalism because it's everywhere. But that's the point. Bougie culture is everywhere. And with bougie culture becoming everywhere, Barthes thinks that this means that bougie culture actually becomes the idea of the nation, because again, they've spread themselves across the culture, they've gained economic power, their interests become the nation state's interests, because everything which they own is kind of within the nation state and begins to influence those points of power. Even the working class will end up allying themselves to the bougie if they feel that American interests are more important than their own economic interests. After all, people will talk about themselves as American before they even talk about themselves as a minimum wage worker, even though the latter has much more to do with what they actually are living through. Bougie culture takes over all through the ideals of the nation that mythically suggest that this is the way things are naturally, that we live out of time, again, much like Captain America does, As an American, you are not a historical product of the systems that made you an American. You are naturally American in your soul. You were born American. You are always American. And remember, the myth of America that Captain America is connected to is one that presents as a naturalized and simple and eternal good. Myth makes history become nature. Which is not to say that you should burn your passport, but it's important to remember that myth removes the complexity from human action. And it also removes the idea of social structures, which influence how you even got to become an American. And it gets rid of all the complicated and messy history connected to the American state, the American nation, which has been built up over hundreds of years now. With the myth, man-made things start to look like just natural occurrences. They start to look like natural phenomenons because the myth which Captain America represents convinces you it always existed. It is unchanging from the 1940s right up to the 2020s. You weren't born an American. You didn't come out of your mother red, white, and blue. The federal government of America designated you an American at your birth in a hospital where they prepped your birth certificate, and then you became an American by a social structure. You were just born as a baby. There was no national identity connected to you as you came out of your mother's womb. Because of this, it begins to look like we didn't actually have a choice in how society is structured. Through the way myth suggests we ought to think about its concepts, it becomes depoliticized. Myth depoliticizes. People will ask the question, why are you trying to make Captain America political? But that is the perfect example as to what the problem is. The symbol of Captain America kind of ends up naturalizing the product of political decisions and social structures. It kind of tells you that you had no choice in these things. Captain America's Americanness is natural, it's default, it's completely non-political, despite the opposite being true. People start to see things as just being, and when you bring politics into it, you are disturbing nature. You're not critiquing historical inaccuracies. As we've said before, the myth is suggesting an innocent version of the concept, and it is trying to impose a certain worldview. It wants you to believe that there are no conflicting ideas, there's only essentials for America. You can't have an argument about it, you can't come with two different perspectives. There is one America. To criticize Captain America is to criticize the true American patriot, which is to criticize something which is naturally good and makes you the enemy. And it's this powerful myth which Trump has pulled from as well, and we're in the part of the video essay where I talk about Trump. Trump doesn't need to be coherent, he doesn't need to make sense or put together a comprehensive worldview. He just needs to say something the right way for people to associate it with the American myth. It's more important that Trump uses simplicity in his messaging. The America that he wants to go back to doesn't even need to have existed. He just needs to let people dream of it and believe that it's the way the world should be.
Keep Freya off your back. Keep your boy safe. That's really all you want, isn't it? So what do you say?
No.
Now, Barthez does suggest an answer to myth and how to combat myth. And look, I'm not even fully convinced by it, but we'll go over it anyway. So you have the status quo, which wants to keep the world the same, and then you have those outside of the status quo who want to change things or change their current circumstances. So myth for the status quo is super useful in that it keeps things the same, and it makes you think that the way things are natural and good, and that's the function of myth in a line. So then that means that myth ends up using gesture-based language, it uses very theatrical language, it uses stationary language, language which kind of just keeps things in place. While if you want to change the world, Barthez thinks that you need to use active language, you need to use political language, and you need to use transitional language, as in language which changes things. That doesn't mean there's no myth outside of the status quo or on the left. There are some, but they're pretty ineffective because in bougie society, which has taken over things culturally, there are so few symbols left to use. Every status quo concept can use any symbol because every symbol becomes representative of the bougie, while myth for the non-status quo is left with so few things to use to really exemplify itself. So let's try and take a Captain Socialism, or something like that. I know it sounds cringe, but let's just for a second pretend that could be a thing. So you have Captain Socialism. Whenever it comes to trying to relate Captain Socialism to what socialism means for a socialist, there's very few things in capitalist society to compare. Most images are connected to capitalism now, so whenever you connect anything socialist to a capitalist item, it kind of doesn't work. I think a lot of the time you actually end up showing the way that capitalism views socialism, because capitalism itself has built its myth of socialism for itself. It is built up this idea that socialism is this death cult of poverty. And then you even have the other kind of socialist myth that exists, which is the socialist myth presented by posh university students who sound like utter twats while telling you how cool Stalin was while sucking on a fucking vape. And those university students for Barthes are actually there because they're viewed as acceptable by the system. They're viewed as accepted by the status quo because they're not really to worry about. They're not going to do anything. They're not really telling you anything that's going to change the system as things are. They're actually using the same language as the status quo. They create a myth for the left, which is always going to end up losing out to the more prevalent myth of the right. So how should we respond to myth if you are actually outside of the status quo? Well, for Barthes, the opposite of the mythical language is the language of the political. Where myth talks about something, political language speaks of doing something. It talks about changing things now, it addresses actions, it addresses reality, and it addresses history. But that can sound a little bit like a cop-out kind of crap answer, like how's that any different? We can say that the language of myth talks about cutting down a tree, while political language would say, I am cutting down this tree, or I will cut down this tree. It's the language of someone who's producing, or the language of someone who actually is doing something, not talking about doing something. And that's kind of how you evade myth, is through active, political, real, changing language. Something where you're actually addressing reality instead of going on this secondary level of signification, this mythical signification. You bring it back down to the first level, which addresses reality. It's the language of revolution, Barthes would say, but that's not necessarily saying that you need to grab your balaclava, get your AK, and download your anarchist cookbook so you can go full Luigi mode. It's the language of revolution in the sense of literal movement, of acknowledging things have changed and things will change, that a movement has happened and that it can still happen and that it will happen whether you like it or not. It acknowledges your actual place in the world and history to force you to confront what you are going to do now. Maybe we can use some examples to kind of get this across. Now, we have the comic book series called Marvel The Ultimates. It's set in a parallel universe where the Avengers are a critique of Bush-era politics. Abraham Josephine Reisman from Vulture described it as like the Avengers, but if they were SEAL Team 6, bringing down foreign governments and fighting against the war on terror as a superhero team. And the heroes are not built on innocent myths here. Bruce Banner is an incel, Tony Stark is a drunk, arrogant, incapable billionaire, and Captain America is presented as a 1940s-style racist, homophobic, sexist. The comic book series The Boys then probably bit a line or two from this, and it does act as a pretty interesting critique of Bush-era politics and how America went around the place acting like a superpower, and how there were still some pretty unsavory parts of American culture around like this racist Captain America who says some pretty bad things. And then you have the TV series The Boys that comes along and kind of does the same thing, but for the Trump era, where you have Homelander, who's kind of like a fucked up Captain America Superman hybrid who regularly abuses his power for his own interests. The series also seems to present a pretty brutal assessment of corporate America, you know, showing a company willing to do anything for money. But both series seems to fail to really envisage anything past the critique. You come away from both wondering how you're even meant to respond, likely because both series seems to lack any kind of language of action sometimes. Both just kind of feel like they're full of gestures. They pretend to critique the myth through a certain inversion of myth. which just kind of ends up being another myth in and of itself. I mean, but I do have to say, I do like The Boys a lot. It's not like I dislike the show. It can just feel a little bit bleak sometimes. However, we could take an example of when Captain America himself did this in the normal comic universe to present maybe another approach, which happened during the Vietnam War, where Steve Rogers decided to abandon the Captain America moniker and completely distance himself from America's actions due to what he saw as injustices in the Vietnam War and the general actions of the Vietnam War. He became Nomad, affiliated to No Nation. He took action. He said that he was no longer going to align with America. He used different language than he would usually use. And it did feel like a different and interesting approach. And now we do have the Disney show, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and we do have the upcoming new Captain America movie that possibly, might address some additional kind of racial issues, or may address, the Trump era somewhat more. It does seem like they have the Red Hulk in it, who might be, representative of the American military, possibly. I doubt it, but we'll see. It is Disney, so I don't think they're going to go full anti-American on it, but we'll find out, I guess. I don't think any of this really does get to the kind of core of what Barthez is trying to say. I think he really means that the real political language that he's talking about are in movements like Black Lives Matter, are in movements like Me Too, are in the LGBTQ movements, where you're really addressing reality. You're not doing so through the medium of stories or movies or through any other kind of additional signification processes. You are just directly talking to someone else about what is happening and about what you should do about it. And let's be honest, in the internet age, we kind of don't do this enough. We love doing our political critiques on media. We love doing our political critiques on comic books and on movies and on TV shows and on other YouTube videos, which is what I'm effectively doing now, which I see the irony. But still, Barthez believes that the political language that you need to be doing is literally directly just talking about what's happening and what you should do and how you should do it, and then actually doing it. It's active, it's transitional, it's political.
No, it wasn't me. It was one of them. One of who? Those costumed men. Look, they're escaping in that airborne ship.
So Captain America is a great example of myth making, but we have to think of him as just one example of the superhero genre as a whole. Iron Man is a veiled allusion to the super rich genius who will save the world. That's a pretty clear capitalist myth. The Hulk is an allegory of a man's two emotions, intelligence and anger. That's a myth. Thor is literally a myth. I don't think I need to explain this one. He's a fucking god. It's pretty clear there. But the superhero as a whole represents that myth of the status quo. Hidden away in the gestures, it misrepresents as actions. The superhero rarely addresses wider issues. It never asks why villains just keep on appearing. It just keeps fighting the bad guys and then goes home happy with the day's work. These individuals with such great power to change the world only ever seem to want to prevent it from changing immediately. And that's where people misunderstand the believability of myth, for Barthez at least. We thought that we got too smart to believe in gods and demigods who did unbelievable things, but that's not the trick that myth wants to play on you. Myth wants you to believe that the story it is telling you is not literally true, but conceptually true. You don't need to believe that Captain America exists. You only need to believe the myth that Captain America really represents America. But superhero movies are just the current iteration of the American myth, as put on the movie screen. Before this, it was the action hero. Before that, it was a cowboy. Even before that, it was the World War II movie. Each slightly changing the concept of America to fit the political climate of the time, but continually suggesting to us that this iteration is what America always was. I read comics throughout my youth, and Captain America was one of my favorites, but I think it's important for us to realize the shortcomings present in the form of the superhero. And maybe, if taken into account, we might actually be able to produce a Captain America who is capable of addressing reality. One who does more than just fight the weekly bad guy. Maybe we can find the Captain America who doesn't just appear as the good guy, but actually fights the myths, which have kept things the same. I think it's possible. I think it could be an interesting point of view. I don't necessarily agree completely with Barthez on his kind of view on myth that it can never be left-wing, or that it can never be outside of the status quo. I think we could maybe look at reinterpreting certain ways that myth has been used up to this point and make it work in our favor. I think there have been good examples of that, and I think it's definitely something that we should, at the very least try and look into. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I thought this was an interesting video. I hope you liked it, and I'd be very happy to hear any thoughts or criticism in the comments. This is pretty much the end. I don't know how to end YouTube videos. This is kind of just me talking at this point, so hopefully there's a cut or something that I do, because now I'm just rambling. I think you're meant to say like, subscribe, share, or something like that. I don't know. But I've got another video lined up as well already. I kind of have an idea. I have a lot of ideas, but I have one in particular that I've already scripted out, so hopefully that won't take too long to release. The general idea for the channel, just to give people an idea, is yes, these are video essays, but I'm not just trying to kind of put across my opinion. I really want it to be focused on taking one writer or one thinker, presenting their idea as faithfully as I can, and obviously I won't always be completely successful, but I hope that I can do a decent job. And hopefully kind of put it in a way that is pretty approachable for people. So if people also have any ideas on what they would like me to write about, or kind of thinker that they would like to hear presented, or at least a singular work of a thinker, then I'd be pretty cool to do it. I really like Barthes. I think he's a really approachable thinker whenever you get down to it. He has a lot of good and easy to read stuff. So I think hopefully you can go ahead and maybe read some stuff from him. Mythologies is a great starting point. This is what this video essay was based on, is his work on mythologies. So hopefully you enjoyed, and do the like, comment, and subscribe thing, I guess. Cheers.